I once lost a silly bet to my sister while watching a movie. It was I, Robot, sometime in the mid-2000s. She insisted a line in the film about a vaguely ominous-sounding date like 2035 meant the world was about to become exactly like the movie. I argued that fiction is usually worse at timetables than at moods. We both laughed, but the bet stuck. And every time a new headline about AI pops up, I get a little nudge. Did I guess wrong, or was she reading a different contract between imagination and reality? That tiny family wager encapsulates something bigger. When people in the past pictured our future world, what were they really predicting? Machines in every room? Moon colonies? Or merely the anxieties and desires of their own day? How did those images shape later innovation and politics? That's the question I want to follow with you. How did the past picture our future world? We'll take that question through 5 recurring images that keep coming up in cultural history: the journey to the stars, the life and threat of automata, the dream of flying cars, the fantasy of cities suspended above the earth, and the promise of abundant leisure. For each one, I'll show an early example, trace how it evolves in literature and film, then look at what actually happened technologically and socially. Along the way, we'll see that these futures often tell us less about machines than about ourselves, about fears, hierarchies, and hopes. And yet fiction can be performative, nudging engineers, funders, and publics toward or away from certain possibilities. First stop, the moon. If you want to find a lunar landing long before rocket science, you don't have to look to Victorian engineers alone. You can go all the way back to Lucian of Samosata, a 2nd century CE satirist whose true histories stages a fantastical voyage to the moon. Lucian isn't doing technical speculation. He's skewering travelers' tales and the credulity of audiences. The moon voyage functions as satire, a mirror for earthly follies, an early reminder that a story about the future can be a disguised portrait of the present. Move forward a millennium and change the tone, Johannes Kepler's Somnium, usually translated as the dream, is closer to a proto-scientific thought experiment. Kepler imagines travel to the moon not to mock, but to explore astronomical ideas and the consequences of a Copernican universe. It's less about rockets than about whom such a perspective might free or unsettle. Kepler's piece sits on the boundary between imaginative narrative and technical curiosity. The future here is a tool for thinking through a new scientific paradigm. Then come the satirists and speculative moralists of the Enlightenment. Voltaire's Micromegas sends giant visitors to Earth. Their bewilderment at human squabbles is a way to hold a mirror up to European pettiness. Cyrano de Bergerac, writing in the 17th century, had earlier spun comic flights to the moon that are equal parts satire and imaginative curiosity. What's crucial is genre. Most of these texts are not blueprints for engineers. They're social diagnoses wrapped in spectacle. By the 19th century, the language and pace of speculation change in response to industrial modernity. Jules Verne's From the Earth to the Moon imagines a projectile launched to the moon from a giant cannon. That method, furious, mechanical, Victorian, is telling. Verne lets the technologies of his day do the talking. The idea is to extrapolate current capabilities poetically rather than to foresee the precise mechanism future engineers would use. H.G. Wells, with his own lunar fictions and later interplanetary works, injects more attention to social consequences: who would colonize, what estrangements would follow, how empire and politics play out beyond the atmosphere. Move to the mid-20th century, and you find Asimov and the hard science visions that imagine interstellar politics and economies, not just travel for travel's sake.
When I teach or write about these texts, I like to point out the gap between imaginative logic and material reality. For instance, Verne's cannon is a vividly mechanical answer to a problem that real rocket engineers solved in a very different way. The 20th century's actual route into space were shaped by developments in rocketry, chemistry, and crucially, geopolitics. Sputnik in 1957 marked the first artificial satellite. Yuri Gagarin orbited the Earth in 1961. Apollo 11 put humans on the moon in 1969. Those milestones are not the fulfillment of a single narrative thread, but the intersection of military research, national competition, scientific curiosity, and public appetite. The cultural images of people hopping across craters, flag on a pristine plain, helped create public support, but they also masked the contingency and messiness of the real project: huge budgets, political calculus, life support engineering, and ultimately, profound ethical and environmental questions. Yet there's another side. Fiction inspires. The engineers and scientists who built rockets and wrote the software for early space missions often absorbed the images of the culture around them. One of the most interesting dynamics here is the two-way street. Literature borrows from technology to imagine, and those imaginings recombine into motivations for scientists. You can see it in the way stories turn national narratives, exploration, conquest, manifest destiny, into cosmic terms. People wanted to be part of those heroic narratives. Funding and policy followed. Long before Apollo, people read about the moon in a way that made the mission feel like the next chapter in a story they already knew. But that inspiration comes with translation losses.
The social claims coded into early space fiction about heroism, empire, or transcendence do not automatically survive contact with reality. A moon landing does not resolve underlying inequalities, nor does it make vanished certainties about human nature any clearer. The romance of the lunar voyage can coexist with the geopolitics and environmental costs of heavy industry and military competition. So when we ask whether past visions came true, the right answer is often some technical elements were realized, many social claims were not, and the images themselves reshaped how people understood those technical developments. If that first block felt like looking at a family album of fantasies, some photographically prescient, most revealing about the family members who posed for the camera, then the second block examines a different obsession, the machine that looks like us, or at least behaves like us, automata and robots. The story of automata is old. In ancient theaters and religious shrines, there were mechanical wonders, puzzle boxes, moving statues that produced a kind of technological magic. Greek playwrights like Aristophanes toyed with the idea of artificial agents for comic effect. In other cultural registers, you find the golem, a creature fashioned from clay and brought to life in Jewish folklore, a story that wrestles with the ethics of creating servants and the dangers of uncontrolled creation. Across cultures, there's a recurring apprentice of the sorcerer motif. Humans enlist mechanical or enchanted helpers and then lose control. That narrative expresses a deep anxiety. Power without wisdom tends to boomerang. Modernity gives the motif new names and new anxieties. Karel Čapek's 1920 play, R.U.R., Rossum's Universal Robots, famously introduced the word robot, borrowed from a Czech term meaning forced labor. Čapek is not predicting silicon-based neural networks. He crafts a parable about industrial dehumanization, factory labor, and the social costs of mechanized production. The robots in his play stand in for exploited workers and for the commodification of life. That's why the play lands as both social critique and speculative provocation. Popular cinema and TV recast the trope for new audiences.
the benign mechanical servant, the rebellious automaton, the sentient threat that overturns human hierarchies. Films like I, Robot play with Asimovian ideas, laws of robotics intended to prevent harm, but juxtapose them with corporate conspiracies and human failings. The Terminator franchise turns the automaton into a purely destructive force, a mirror for anxieties about runaway military technology. Contemporary anthology shows, Black Mirror for instance, transpose those older worries into data-rich settings where surveillance, algorithmic governance, and social media amplify the modern resonance. What happens when our tools reflect and magnify our worst incentives? Asimov himself is a critical pivot in this history.
His stories reframed the conversation by formalizing constraints, the famous laws of robotics, that are less about physical possibility and more about imaginaries of safety. Asimov's fiction helped popularize a model where governance principles, not just technological specs, matter. Engineers and ethicists increasingly talk about guardrails for emerging technologies, and in popular imagination, Asimov gives one early vocabulary for that idea. But there's an important qualitative difference between early automata and contemporary AI. The antique automaton is steel and clockwork, its capacities tied to gears and cams. Today's intelligent systems are often software embodiments, statistical models trained on vast data sets. That shift matters. Early robot fears were material and visible. A humanoid machine stomps through a factory. Modern anxieties are about opacity. Systems that make consequential decisions, from loan approvals to policing algorithms, and do so in ways many of us cannot fully inspect. This raises ethical questions Catholic to the history of the automaton. Who designs the rules? Who benefits? Who is surveilled? And what happens when incentives are misaligned? Another continuity, labor. Čapek's introduction of robot connected the concept to work and exploitation. Today's conversations about automation, especially automation driven by machine learning, recycle that problem in new key. Will automation free people for creative and fulfilling lives, or will it concentrate wealth and offload risk onto precarious workers? Much of the dream of a leisure-rich future, something I'll come back to, gets entangled with the robot narrative, because the same techniques that could produce abundance could also exacerbate inequality. The technical possibility of substitution doesn't automatically translate into social arrangements that distribute benefits widely. A final note in this block is about metaphor and function. Robots in stories often do double duty. They are both stand-ins for oppressed labor and symbols of existential risk. The danger they dramatize is not merely technological failure, but social failure, the collapse of shared ethical norms, legal frameworks, or economic safety nets. That's why debates about AI governance today, about transparency, accountability, and the politics of data, feel like a continuation of century-old concerns. The machine is a canvas on which societies paint their anxieties and hopes. Quick aside before we speed to the next image, a short note about support. This video's research and editing are supported by an online learning platform that offers courses in cultural history and the history of science. Links and recommended readings are in the description if you want to dig deeper. That's the only interruption. I'll keep the rest of the argument uninterrupted and add light. Another conventional future, the flying car.
If space travel imagines moving outward, and automata imagine replacing certain kinds of labor, the flying car imagines mobility remade. Personal vehicles that escape congestion by rising into the vertical dimension. The trope is almost comically resilient in popular culture. Who hasn't seen the gleaming lanes of suspended traffic in The Jetsons, or the cluttered neon airways of Blade Runner, or the sugary futurism of Back to the Future Part 2. In each case, the flying car is shorthand for a future of convenience, effortless mobility, and, depending on the text, either liberatory possibility or dystopian overcrowding. Historically, the idea of human flight precedes flying cars by centuries. There are engineering sketches, Leonardo da Vinci's studies among them, that play with human uplift. Ballooning in the late 18th century gave the first taste of flight that was not divine. In different places, inventors and tinkerers tried variations, lighter-than-air designs, gliders, and eventually powered aircraft. Names like Bartolomeo de Guzman, an early experimenter with balloon travel, surface in national histories as milestones for public imagination. The Zeppelins of the early 20th century temporarily shifted the scale of public expectation. Large, passenger-carrying airships promised a different relationship to distance and luxury, even if they proved vulnerable in other ways. Why, then, did the flying car not become a ubiquitous reality? The answer mixes the technical with the social. Technically, making a vehicle that combines the convenience and safety of an automobile with the stability and energy efficiency of an aircraft is fiendishly hard. You need propulsion systems that are compact and safe, control systems robust enough for untrained pilots in dense urban airspaces, and energy sources that don't weigh more than their lift. Safety is not merely a matter of better engineering, it's a regulatory and infrastructural challenge. Airspace is a commons that requires coordination, air traffic control on a massive scale, rules about takeoff and landing, and liability frameworks for accidents that would occur over populated areas. Then there are social effects and economic viability. Streets and parking lots are part of a broader urban apparatus: zoning laws, gas stations, parking revenues, commuter economies. Introducing personal flight would redistribute economic rents and regulatory power in ways that many entrenched interests might resist. Even if technology reaches viability, the social and political incentives to adopt wholesale change are not straightforward. Partial realizations appear in our own era. Drones and prototype vertical takeoff and landing, VTOL designs get tested for niche applications: package delivery, air taxis for short routes, military logistics. Those developments borrow from the flying car imagination, but do not equal it. The drone is often unmanned, remapping expectations about who is behind the wheel.
The flying car's promise, ubiquitous personal aerial mobility, faces not only engineering hurdles, but a different kind of question. Is a society willing to trade its current forms of surveillance, noise pollution, and inequitable access for three-dimensional commuting? At this point in the story, we begin to see a pattern across these images. The futures people sketch are rarely simple technical forecasts. They are clinical images of social hope and fear. Space travel reveals imperial aspirations and scientific curiosity. Automata dramatize labor anxieties and ethical governance. Flying cars expose infrastructural and political constraints. Each image performs a work on its own era as much as it orients toward a possible tomorrow. I'll stop there for now, but the thread we're following keeps going into other recurring images: cities that hover between sky and earth, and the perennial promise that machines will buy us time for a life of leisure. What I've tried to show so far is that the past's visions of the future are kaleidoscopes. Rearrange the glass, and you see the same shapes refracted by different anxieties and technological realities. The next section takes us into those vertical fantasies and into the political stakes of a leisure-rich promise, and it will ask again, when fiction prescribes a future, who benefits and who is left below?
If that first stretch felt like paging through a gallery of well-staged dreams, here's a small favor. If you like these cultural history deep dives, go ahead and hit subscribe and check the description for the sources I used. There are links and recommended readings there. Now, back to the story. Next image, the city that floats or hangs above the ordinary world. Why do so many futures picture their elites literally rising up and away? Go back far enough and you find the idea in comedy and satire. Aristophanes, the 5th century BCE Athenian playwright, imagined a community of birds that secede from the world below and set up a sky-born polity, an early theatrical riff on exile, superiority, and the absurdities of political aspiration. Move forward to Jonathan Swift's Laputa in Gulliver's Travels, 1726, a literally floating island whose inhabitants are preoccupied with abstract mathematics and impractical science. Both plays use lift, actual physical elevation, as a metaphor. Being above the messy necessities of life is tied to certain kinds of intellectual arrogance or social detachment. In the 20th century, cinema and video games made the vertical city an irresistible visual shorthand. Fritz Lang's Metropolis, 1927, carves its world into subterranean workers and elevated executives. The film's architecture makes class lines architectural facts.
Games and later filmic imaginings like BioShock's Rapture and the 2007 video game literalize libertarian escape. A sealed, underwater city intended to be free from regulation and moral constraint becomes a cautionary tale about the social consequences of leaving ethics to market logic. Even anime and 20th century science fiction often present floating cities as elite sanctuaries, places designed to preserve a select few from the perceived decadence or chaos of the ground level. Why is suspension such a potent metaphor? First, elevation simplifies a political image. Distance equals superiority. If you live above the clouds, you can literally look down on the rest of humanity. Second, verticality promises technical mastery over hostile terrain, sea, jungle, disease-ridden cities, so it stands in for a fantasy of spatial escape when political or social remedies seem impossible. Third, floating cities compress anxieties about scarcity and containment. If the ground is crowded, polluted, or contested, then building upward or outward seems like a straightforward architectural fix. So what about real life? Have we built cities that float? In material terms, not in the sense of mass-market, sky-born metropolises filled with entire populations. We do have powerful approximations and intriguing partials. Skyscrapers, those monuments of vertical segregation, are ordinary in many urban skylines. They cut the city into floors with different kinds of users and incomes. The International Space Station, orbiting since the late 20th century, is a tiny multinational microcity of scientists living in suspended isolation. It is, however, enormously expensive per capita and highly specialized. Seasteading experiments and modular floating platforms have been floated as possibilities. Some designers imagine private enclaves on the ocean, but these remain niche experimental, expensive, and politically fraught ventures rather than mass metropolitan solutions. Technically, the obstacles are significant. Building to sustain large populations in the sky, on floating islands, or even in orbit, requires energy and materials on scales that are hard to achieve cheaply. Supply chains, waste recycling, food production, and governance create a series of engineering problems that interact with legal and political ones. Who controls the airspace or the ocean territory? Which laws apply above the clouds or beyond territorial waters? Who funds the infrastructure, and who pays for maintenance when storms and corrosion inevitably take their toll? Beyond pure engineering, there's a political dimension. Floating cities often entail social exclusion. If buildable at scale, they're likely to be the province of the wealthy, at least initially.
That's a consistent historical theme. Escape fantasies almost always have a class register. Metropolis didn't separate people vertically by accident, it staged a warning. Rapture, with its promise of freedom from oversight, shows what happens when governance is privatized. The technology of suspension simplifies the political question, who gets above, instead of solving it. A related modern debate concerns vertical urban planning that isn't literally airborne. High-rise luxury residential towers, gated aerial residences, and private sky gardens reconfigure cities into levels of habitation with different qualities of light, service, and risk. These interventions are manageable within existing logistical frameworks, unlike a floating city in the technical sense, but they reproduce many of the same social dynamics. So the fantasy of the floating city has been partially realized, technically and socially, but typically in ways that sharpen inequality rather than morally redeem it. One interesting twist, the metaphor flips when environmental crises enter the imaginations. Far from an elite escape, floating platforms are sometimes proposed as survival strategies for rising seas or climate refugees, projects meant to host the dispossessed rather than the privileged. That vision reframes the suspended city as a pragmatic adaptation rather than a status tableau. But it also raises questions about governance, resource allocation, and international politics of refuge. The core insight remains. Fantasies of vertical living spotlight political choices. Who benefits from new architectures of habitation? Who must stay below? Mini-hook. Floating cities are not merely engineering fantasies. They're sketches of how societies imagine political escape, privilege, and survival. Now let's take the last promised paradise, leisure. The dream of liberated time is one of the oldest and most persistently frustrating images in forward-looking thought. Think of it as the most tantalizing promise. Machines will do the work, people will have time to study, make, love, and contemplate. The intellectual lineage here is long. You can glimpse the idea in ancient thought. Classical discussions about tools and servitude, most famously in Greek thought, suggest that instruments or domestic slaves could free citizens for contemplation and civic life. When Aristotle and his contemporaries debated leisure and activity, they were wrestling with what a polity requires of its citizens and the conditions under which philosophical life is possible. The conversation presupposed forms of unfreedom, enslavement, gendered labor that made leisure a political privilege rather than a universal right. Fast forward, 19th century social engineers like Claude-Henri de Rouvroy Comte de Saint-Simon and later thinkers in industrial and socialist traditions speculated that mechanization could create abundance, reduce arduous labor, and enable broader cultural flourishing.
Oscar Wilde, in essays like The Soul of Man Under Socialism, 1891, imagined a world in which the economic shackles were loosened, enabling individual development and idleness as virtues rather than stigmas. Then, in 1930, John Maynard Keynes wrote his famous essay, Economic Possibilities for Our Grandchildren, predicting that technology and growth would, within a century, reduce the struggle for subsistence enough that ordinary people in wealthy countries might work only 15 hours a week. Keynes's projection was not merely numerical, it was a vision of reorienting human energies away from survival toward higher pursuits. So why didn't this universal leisure arrive? The short answer is that productivity gains do not automatically translate into universal freedom from labor. There are at least three interacting reasons. First, the political economy of distribution matters. Productivity can increase output without reducing labor hours for everyone if the gains are captured by capital rather than widely shared. Technological efficiencies can swell profits and asset values instead of shortening the working day.
In many industrial and post-industrial economies, shareholder returns, executive compensation, and the valorization of capital around real estate and intellectual property draw much of the economic surplus produced by automation. Second, consumption habits morph. As goods and services become cheaper, and as advertising and consumer credit expand, societies often redirect freed capacity into new forms of consumption. That process, visible in the 20th century, meant that people who might have worked less instead acquired more goods, traveled more, or consumed novel services. In a cultural economy, new desires are invented as old ones are satisfied. The needs that liberation promised are reframed by markets into new pathways for economic activity. Third, social structures and norms shift slowly. Even if a technology can reduce necessary labor, labor struggles, political bargaining, union movements, and legislation determine the balance between time for leisure and time for paid work. Look at recent automation debates. AI and robotics can replace routine tasks, but whether that replacement produces shorter work weeks or higher unemployment, greater inequality, or a renaissance of creative time depends on policy choices. Some proposals floated in current discourse, public investments, stronger social protections, reduced work weeks, and experiments with universal basic income attempt to channel automation's gains toward wider well-being. Others argue for retraining, entrepreneurship, and market mechanisms. The technology itself is ambiguous, its social impact is political.
This is an important recurring lesson of retrofuturism. Imagining abundance without thinking about institutions is incomplete. Economics is not just a physics problem. It is also a question about the rules of society. The same is true for many other images we've discussed. A moon base is technically conceivable, but who funds it and why? A flying car may be engineered, but who controls the airways? A city that floats could be built, but will it be a refuge for elites or a shelter for the displaced? Mini-hook. If earlier futures reveal their time's anxieties and hopes, then our futures today are doing the same, especially around AI. So what do we take away overall? Synthesis. What past futurisms teach us about imagining the future? We can pull a few connected lessons from these cultural images. 1. Imaginaries reflect present concerns more than they predict future details. Whether Lucian's moon voyage skewers gullibility or Chopek's robots diagnose industrial exploitation, these texts use future settings to diagnose their own times. Genre matters. Satire, utopia, and dystopia articulate different social critiques. To read them as literal forecasts is to miss the diagnostic function they often serve. 2. Fiction is performative in the modest but real sense that stories shape ambitions, funding priorities, and aesthetic templates. Engineers and scientists are cultural beings. Many who work in aerospace, computing, or architecture grew up reading narratives that made certain futures feel meaningful, heroic, or inevitable. The images that circulate in popular culture, sparked by literature, film, and games, make certain futures socially thinkable. That doesn't mean stories cause technical progress in a single line of causation. Rather, they create cultural materials, desires, metaphors, role models that can be marshaled for political and technical mobilization. When funders, publics, and policymakers accept a story about exploration or safety, that story can influence budgets and regulation. 3. The details matter. Past futurisms corrected or misled engineers in different ways. Jules Verne's projectile gun is not how rockets work, but Verne's imaginative confidence in mechanical extrapolation helped create an atmospherically permissive culture for engineering innovations. Asimov's laws of robotics offered a vocabulary for governance concerns long before modern AI research could implement anything like hard safeguards.
The point is not predictive accuracy, but conceptual scaffolding. The ways people think about problems shapes the types of solutions they pursue. 4. Technology isn't destiny. Many retro-futurist disappointments, no flying cars for everyone, no universal leisure, aren't failures of engineering alone. They are failures of politics or of distribution. New technologies arrive into pre-existing institutions and interests that reconfigure their social effects.
That's both sobering and useful. It means political choices remain decisive in shaping whether technological change benefits the many or the few. 5. Ethical imagination is essential. Many speculative texts warn precisely because they dramatize moral dilemmas. What happens when humans lose control of their creations? What norms are necessary for inventions to support flourishing rather than exploitation? Reading old futurisms as ethical thought experiments, ways to rehearse possible dilemmas, can sharpen our contemporary debates about AI governance, climate engineering, and bioethics. To be more concrete, when we debate algorithmic fairness today, we are not only talking about model architecture, we are picking up a tradition in which automata symbolize the social consequences of offloading labor and responsibility. When we imagine orbital hotels or lunar industrial complexes, we inherit rhetorical scaffolding from earlier space fantasies that mixed exploration with empire. Being conscious of that lineage helps us see not only technical constraints, but ideological inheritances. A short case study in performativity, rockets and national narratives. Spaceflight, Sputnik, Gagarin, Apollo, was possible because of metallurgy, propulsion chemistry, and decades of specialist engineering. But it also satisfied national narratives about modernity, power, and prestige. The Apollo program's political meaning was as important as its engineering solutions. Popular culture made lunar imagery into an available stock of meanings, heroism, progress, technological mastery, that politicians could harness. That is not to reduce achievement to rhetoric. Engineers still had to solve impossible problems. It is instead to note the mutual dependence. Technical possibility met cultural appetite. Where appetites were absent, projects were harder to sustain. A similar dynamic appears in AI. The current wave of generative models and automation solves certain technical problems by statistical means, pattern recognition, generative synthesis, optimization. Yet the social uses and governance regimes that determine who benefits from these tools are political choices. When we imagine a future in which AI helps free people from drudgery, we must also imagine institutions that allocate resources, protect rights, and secure dignity. Climax. What does it mean to ask, how did the past picture our future world? The question is both historical and political. Historically, the answer is they pictured futures that were soaked in their own present's preoccupations. Politically, the implication is that the futures we choose to imagine matter because they make some things conceivable and other things invisible. Imagination is not neutral. It privileges certain problems, certain actors, and certain solutions. So here's the final provocation I want to leave you with. Take a moment to look at what we are imagining now. What are today's ubiquitous images of the future?
Ubiquitous computing agents, climate-scarred landscapes, huge data towers, biotech interventions, smart cities, and the colonization of Mars all compete for our attention. Each of these images does normative work. It suggests who should have power, what counts as progress, and what problems are addressable by technology rather than politics. Which of these images center equity, repair, and democratic governance? Which are primarily pitched to consumers, investors, or the militaries of the world? If we accept one more lesson from the past, it is that a different set of imaginings can change the direction of invention.
stories that make egalitarian futures thinkable, those that imagine universal care, broadly shared leisure, and democratic oversight, create a cultural resource for building institutions that aim in that direction. They do not on their own produce policy, but they expand the space of the politically imaginable. The future is partly made by engineers and partly by the narratives that make certain projects legible and fundable. We have a hand in choosing which narratives to amplify. A few practical takeaways for someone who wants to think practically about present imaginaries. Read older speculative texts as social diagnostics rather than mechanical forecasts. They tell you what worried and inspired people, which helps you understand the ideological work that technological images do. Pay attention to who funds and benefits from technological projects. Technical possibility and social distribution are always entangled. Cultivate ethical imagination, that is, rehearse not just technical solutions, but institutional frameworks around them. Governance shapes outcomes as much as engineering does. Support a plurality of imaginaries, not a monoculture of techno-optimism. Diversifying the stories we tell about the future makes other futures more thinkable. Final aside about sources and sponsorship. The short pause I took earlier to mention a sponsor was the only interruption I'll give the argument. Sources for the historical examples and further reading are in the description. Translations of Lucian's True Histories, Kepler's Somnium, Chopek's RUR, Keynes's essay, and analyses of Metropolis and Bioshock, among other pieces. Those links will give you a pathway if you want to follow any of these threads more deeply. One last image to close the loop. Imagine a museum exhibit on the future. The placards are organized not chronologically, but thematically. A cannon from Jules Verne sits beside a schematic of a Saturn V rocket. A clockwork automaton shares a vitrine with a diagram of a modern neural network. The Jetsons' flying car sketches sit next to drone prototypes. The captions do not pretend that these objects told the future in precise detail. Instead, they explain how each object expresses a set of cultural arguments about work, mobility, governance, and belonging.
Walk through that museum and you will learn two things: how people of the past dreamed and how those dreams, in turn, helped shape the limits and possibilities of our present. So, how did the past picture our future world? It did so with the tools of its own present: satire to expose credulity, technical extrapolation to imagine extension of current machines, utopia and dystopia to wrestle with moral trade-offs. Sometimes those images nudged inventors and policymakers in directions that led to real technologies. More often, they clarified problems that remained political rather than merely technical. The task for us is to be attentive, to ask which images we are amplifying today, and to choose, deliberately, which futures to make thinkable. If this conversation resonated, I'd love to know which retrofuturist image sticks with you: flying cars, moon voyages, city towers, or the robot at the heart of the factory? Drop your pick in the comments, subscribe if you want more of these cultural histories, and check the description for the readings I mentioned. If you want to keep going, there are two related videos I recommend next. One on the history of automata and golem myths, and another on the cultural politics of spaceflight, which you can find linked below. Thanks for sticking with me through these 5 images. The futures we pass on are not neutral gifts, they are arguments. The better question than did they come true might be, which of their arguments do we want to inherit?